So we are here at one of our postdoc interviews with Dr. Jon Stevens. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background, how you got to The Ohio State University?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio.
Nice.
Born right down the street at Riverside Hospital. And I went here as an undergraduate, and I graduated in 2008 with a BA/MA in linguistics, the linguistics department. And so while I was here, I decided I wanted to go into academia and be a linguist, get a PhD. So ultimately, I decided to go to University of Pennsylvania for my PhD.
Yes.
And then my first postdoc was at a research institute in Berlin called the Center for General Linguistics. So that was a lot of fun, good experience to get some time overseas, build up my research profile. And while I was there, a postdoc position funded by the ACLS, one of these humanities postdocs, popped up in the Ling department, which was, my home department.
Yes.
The faculty had changed somewhat, but there were a lot of familiar faces. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to come back to my hometown and my home university, and it's a great department anyway. So I decided to go all in and try to get that job, and I did. And so here I am.
That's great to hear that you're here. So kind of to follow up on that, what would you say you like most about being a postdoc at The Ohio State University?
Yeah, so I think that being a postdoc in general is great. I think it's the cushiest job that anybody will ever have, because you get to devote, most of your time toward your research, and there are also opportunities to get more experience teaching, right? But the teaching load is light and more manageable, and so you really have more time to explore the things that fascinate you as a postdoc, as opposed to, professorships where there's a lot more administrative duties and things like that. So being a postdoc in general is super fun, and I definitely recommend it. Being a postdoc at Ohio State has been great. As I said, it's kind of my home department, and I always, I got into linguistics because the department here was so strong in that area, and I love everybody that I work with, and it's a great department, and and of course, it's a great university, and it's a good environment, I think, to be in, where there's a lot of resources available for me to sort of further my research.
Yes, definitely. The sense of community, I think, is pretty strong for a school that's so big, and kind of finding these departments, linguistics, and kind of smaller communities within this large environment here is very empowering in a way, finding those people.
I agree. And I think because it's a lot different in a department like linguistics than in, a much larger department.
Some of the larger ones, like engineering or something.
Because I don't really get the sense that I'm at this huge university. I mean, I know that I am, but you're right. There's a sort of smaller sub-community within that.
Yeah, so can you follow up more about your research? What do you do exactly?
Right, so I'm a linguist. I'm a computational linguist, first and foremost, which means that I build computer models of how people interact with language. And my research is primarily in the field of pragmatics, which is the study of non-literal meaning, basically, right? So when people talk to each other, much of what we say is actually unsaid, right? Much of the meaning that we convey is unsaid. And we are constantly drawing inferences about what we mean, right? So, just to take a sort of standard example from sort of introductory classes on this, right? If you say something like, some of the students passed the exam, that sentence logically means that some of the students passed the exam. In fact, maybe all of them did. You don't really know, right? But in context, people will almost always draw the inference that not all of them passed, that there were at least some people who failed, because if you wanted to say that all of them passed, you would have said that, right? And so that kind of reasoning about trying to figure out what a sentence means in context by reasoning about, well, what would they have said if they meant X versus what would they have said if they meant Y, right? And this has all sorts of implications for how we interpret, numbers. There's a difference between, if you walk by a bar and there's a sign outside that says you must be 21, of course, does not mean you must be exactly 21, right? But if somebody asks you your age, you wouldn't say 21 if you meant 31, right? So how we reason and how we get those non-literal meanings are part of pragmatics. And so what I do is to build computational models of that, both to help better understand how it works, right? So if you have a hypothesis about what people are doing and how people are reasoning in this way, you can model it, implement it, and then do experiments and see if the experimental data lines up with what your model thinks people should be doing, right? So that'll assess, that's one way to assess just hypotheses that are aimed at just understanding things better on a purely academic level. But then also, there are potential practical applications. One of the main projects I worked on in Berlin was a dialogue system project where basically, we were dealing with like chatbots where we were trying to get chatbots to know when to produce indirect answers, right? So people are often indirect with each other, but it's really tricky because human beings, like, we know what's relevant and what's not, so we know sort of how to be indirect, and it's not so easy for a computer system because the computer system doesn't have all that world knowledge, right? So how do you model, indirectness, for example? So that was a big component, and now I'm working more on kind of the experimental side. What I talked about is sort of modeling experiments and seeing whether we can actually observe behavior in the lab that kind of lines up with what these models predict.
Yes, definitely. So that real world application of, we have these kind of probabilities or statistics or models. Now let's see, how does it apply? Does it fit to this model? Exactly.
So, like, for example, one of the projects I'm currently working on here with some colleagues in the faculty, the Ling faculty at Ohio State, is building models of how people make inferences from the intonation patterns that we use. In English, right, I mean, the sentence stays the same, but the meaning can nonetheless be very, very different. So there's a big difference in the meaning that you get from if I say, John didn't show up to the interview late versus John didn't show up to the interview late, right?
Yes.
Those two pronunciations, it's the same sentence, it's the same basic meaning on some level, but you can get very different kind of inferences about, with the first one, you're sort of suggesting that somebody else was late, it just wasn't John, right? So there's all these additional shades of meaning that correlate with the kind of intonation you choose. And of course, as human beings, like, we just do this automatic, like, it's no problem to figure this out, right? But how are we doing it, right? And how would you actually get a computer system to do this, right? Going back to the practical applications, I mean, you'll start to notice now if you use like Siri or something, pay attention now to the intonational things, right? Because they're often extremely unnatural and don't really line up correctly with the meaning that Siri's trying to convey, right? So it's kind of like there's a lot of room for improvement, right? And it's an area where I think like a little bit of linguistic theory could help. I was looking for a demonstration of this for a class, and it was like, I asked Siri who's the CEO of Apple.
Yes.
And it said, it came back with Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple. With
that
emphasis on Apple.
Intonation.
And it's sort of, no human being would ever do this, right? I mean, no English speaker would ever produce that sentence in that way. And it's such a simple fix, right? That you're asking who, so the person's name should have the emphasis.
So another follow-up question, since this is a very kind of particular area to study, what made you go into it and pursue linguistics? Kind of what inspired you to study this?
Yeah, good question. So I was one of two or maybe three. It's been enough years now, I have to think. But I think I was one of three incoming freshmen who were committed linguistics majors. In other words, this is a major that, like, most people don't know about in high school. So it was extremely rare that, and I think that's also changing. I get the sense that there are more and more linguistics undergrads committing earlier and earlier, which is great. It's a growing field. But, back in, 2004, when I was first coming to Ohio State as an undergrad, nobody became a linguistics major till like halfway through their college career because they just didn't know what it was. So for most people, it was like you had to take, your what they call GEC classes. Then I don't know if they still
Gen
call them
Eds now.
Gen Eds,
Eds.
They right, of course. So you had to take the Gen Ed courses, and somebody would just sort of stumble on it and say, "Oh, this is really cool."
Oh, this is cool. Let me take a class.
Exactly. But for me, I knew about it early on for a couple of reasons. So I was always really into like foreign languages. So my favorite class in high school was always German, and I did really well at it. So I got kind of interested in like differences between English and German, and like, of course, they're very similar languages, right? But
Definitely,
if
yes.
you know them both, you know that like there are also some very salient differences, and sort of like, okay, how different can languages be from each other? It was a question I was really interested in from a really young age, right? And then I learned things like tones and stuff, and so then I found out about that, and I was like, God, that's really different from English and from German. So how different can languages be from each other, and what are the ways in which they're similar? So that was always sort of a general thing I was interested in. And then when I was in high school, I had an older sister who was also a student here, a German major.
So it kind of runs in the family.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The German
exactly.
tradition.
Yeah, we all took German for some reason. I don't know why, but the
Do you have any relations to Germany?
Yeah, I've got my one of my grandmother's family is like mostly German, but I actually didn't know that when I started taking German.
Okay.
I found out about it later. And
Well, now with Ancestry.com
Right.
and whatnot, you can kind of investigate.
Yeah,
what
exactly. So yeah, so she was taking linguistics just as part of the foreign language major, just the intro course, and she brought her textbook home, the language files, which is still the book that's actually written by the department here.
Really?
The
Okay.
textbook, linguistics textbook that's used all over the place and still used today in an updated form. So she brought home the language files, and I was just sort of flipping through it, and I was like, oh my God, there's a whole like field of study about exactly these kind of nerdy things that I was into. So I thought, well, I've got to pick a major at some point.
Yes.
So I might as well just pick linguistics now, and if I hate it, of course, I can just switch, right?
Always, yes.
But obviously, I never switched.
Well, that's actually very interesting. Yeah. Couple more questions just about you. So, when you're not doing research, working, what's something that you like to do that's kind of unique to you?
Well, I have played guitar since I was a child, so that's one of my main hobbies. Back when I was an undergraduate here, I was in a band. I was a rock guitarist.
Cool.
I've mellowed out in my old age, so I mostly just play, like folk songs on my acoustic guitar. And I don't like play concerts as much anymore. Like I mostly just play for my 4-year-old son.
Oh, you have a 4-year-old son.
Goofy songs. Yes, and he enjoys it. So that's something I like doing. And yes, I do have a 4-year-old son, so that's he's great, but he's very rambunctious and obviously takes up a lot of my time.
As I can imagine, yes.
Yeah.
On the topic of that, how would you say you feel about kind of managing your time as a postdoc and also being a parent?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, I think being a parent is the greatest thing in the world. It definitely cuts down on the amount of free time you have, right? So, I mean, that's
Yes.
just a fact. I mean, anybody
Yes.
with kids will tell you, I had children and then suddenly I had way less time. So it can be hard to balance. I mean, especially during particularly busy times. I feel like a lot of times when you're in an academic kind of environment, it's sort of feast or famine, where certain times of the semester will just suddenly be much busier, right? It's not like a constant rate of work. And so, those times can be hard because obviously, I don't, having a family, I value my weekends, I think, a lot more, and my holidays a lot more than I would, if I didn't have one. And so, I want that extra time where I'm not just work, but, sometimes things have to get done. So, you just have the occasional late night, It's not too different. Honestly, at some point it becomes not too different from just being a student where, but for a different reason, like when you're a student, you're up till 2 a.m. because you forgot about your term paper, right? You have to like suddenly like knock it out. And when you're a postdoc, you're up till 2 a.m, but it's because you just have all these obligations.
Child,
and you didn't want to work last weekend because that was this, and there was whatever birthday party. So now it's backed up and you're up late. But it's not, that happens here and there.
Yes, of course.
But it's not, honestly, it's not a huge problem.
Would you say the Ohio State community has helped you out in that aspect then a little bit of maybe managing time with family or giving opportunity or whatnot to be with family and be a researcher, postdoc here?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of flexibility, and the sort of expectations in terms of, I don't know. I think we've all read the horror stories of the postdocs who work 80 hours a week and
Yeah.
have some advisor that, cracks the whip and, makes them stay in the lab all night. And I mean, there's just been none of that, right? I mean, I think that the expectations are very reasonable and the schedule is very flexible, right? I mean, of course, I do teach a course and that's sort of the inflexible part, where, okay, I've got to go when I've got to go. But I mean, when it comes
Yeah.
to, research collaborations and
Definitely.
meeting with colleagues and things, if I've got to if I have to take my son to the doctor or something, like, it's never been a problem. And so I think there's just a flexibility inherent in the job that makes it like really probably a lot more kind of family friendly than a lot of other jobs. I
Hmm.
mean, I think if I had, just an office job or whatever, that I had to be there at this time from this time to that time every day,
Yes.
that becomes a lot harder because
Structure kind of limits
yeah,
that.
because if
Yeah.
you have to move things around, then
Hmm.
it's a lot more difficult. So I think in general, the department here and the university at large, it's a pretty family friendly place to work, and and there's also a fair amount of support, for all the employees, not
Yes.
just the postdocs, but in terms of benefits and
Hmm.
getting insurance for your family members, and so that's nice. I think overall it's a very family friendly place to work.
That's good to know. And I also wanted to ask, so you said you teach a class for anyone who might be curious. What class is that?
Yeah, currently this semester I'm teaching an undergraduate course called Linguistic Meaning. So that's Ling 4400, I believe.
Mhm.
And the title of the course is Linguistic Meaning, and it's supposed to be an introduction to the fields of semantics and pragmatics. So pragmatics, like I already talked about, sort
Yeah.
of that's my wheelhouse, where it sort of has to do with non-literal meaning and inferences about meaning and conversation. Semantics is more on the literal side, like logical analysis of
Yes.
sentence meanings, right? So, what do certain sentences entail, and how do you build up meanings of sentences from the meanings of their parts, right? And so, all that taken together sort of encompasses the study of linguistic meaning and how do different languages convey different meanings. Certain meaning distinctions are more important in some languages than others, right? Like in English, you have to have tense on your verb. Some languages don't mark that, so you
Yes.
just figure it out from context whether the thing happened in the past or whatever. So we cover all of that, right? So it's supposed to be really a kind of survey of all the different ways to study linguistic meaning. Um, and I try to bring in, you know, where appropriate, some connections to computational linguistics,
Yes, of
also to
course.
psychology, right? So anytime you talk about some linguistic phenomenon, you can also talk about how people sort of handle that in their brains, how
Of
people
course.
interpret
Lot of
those things.
interdiscipline.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
try to be very interdisciplinary because I think that linguistics at its core is interdisciplinary. I mean, it's always had this kind of flavor of, yeah, it's the study of language, but it's always been kind of related to computer science and psychology and
Yes.
also sociology. Those It's always borrowed a lot from all those fields. I feel
Yes.
so that it's a natural sort of thing to a natural approach to take.
Okay. And then one last question. So at the end of the day, what is your favorite thing about the research that you do? Your
Ah,
one favorite thing that just makes you light up or just brings passion, emotion, kind of evokes that in you.
that's a good question. I think that I mean, there's a few things that give me joy. I think that the best feeling, though, in terms of when I'm doing research is, I've mentioned that I do a lot of computational modeling,
Yes.
right? So I build up a model of, how we think something might work based on some hypotheses, right? And then um, go out into the world and look at what people actually do in the lab or whatever, and then, try to see how those things line up, right? And I think that the best feeling is when you have a good idea, and you implement it in a model, and you make predictions, and you go get your data, and you look at what people actually do, and it's actually the same, right?
It matches,
Yeah,
yes.
and I mean, to some reasonable extent, it matches, and it's a great feeling because you feel like you really found something out, right? Like
Yes.
you had an idea about the way that these interactions might work, and you went out and you tested it, and having the modeling component really makes you lay out every single assumption that you're making, right? And every single component to your hypothesis and make it completely explicit, right?
Yes.
So you lay it all out very mechanically, and you say, look, if people are really doing this, then here's how it should look. And then it's not always the case that
Definitely not, yes.
that you're correct about that.
No perfect
presumption,
world,
right? I mean,
yes.
sometimes you go out into the world and you say, well, no, that's not what people are doing at all. So let's reassess, right? But on those occasions when you get a good fit between a model and some experimental behavior, I think is just as a researcher, it's a really good feeling because you feel like you've made a discovery, right? I think it's like the equivalent, the computational linguist or the computational cognitive scientist equivalent of, the scientist in the lab coat synthesizing chemicals and saying, "Eureka, I've done it!" Right? Like
definitely,
it's that's kind of the equivalent of that.
Well, yes, that touches kind of on the definition of researcher and scientist. Not always a white lab coat in a lab.
Right.
What you're doing, linguistics. Someone may not think of that as the first thing when they think of postdoc researcher, but it is definitely very interesting, and there's so much around us to study.
Exactly,
Yes.
and I think linguistics is a science, right? I mean, it's classified as it belongs in the humanities for purposes of structuring the university, right?
Because there has to be some sort of structure.
Yeah, and I think traditionally, going back further in time, it was squarely in the humanities, but I think and most universities have it as a humanity, but I think that in modern days, the field of linguistics has become a true social science, right? I mean, there's not a lot of space between what a lot of linguists do and what a lot of psychologists do, for example. And I also mentioned that there are connections with sociology and computer science, and so people don't necessarily know this, right? Like you said, people don't think of linguists having white lab coats. Funny you should mention white lab coats. We actually do have white lab coats. This is a good time to plug our lab. We have a lab at COSI downtown,
really?
The Science Museum, and it's a joint venture between psych and linguistics. So the psychology department and linguistics department kind of run that, and it's a language lab where we do experiments, comprehension experiments in all ages, so we can look at like language acquisition, do experiments on different age groups to see, when certain kinds of linguistic things develop in children as they learn their language. One of the rules of having one of these labs at COSI, so it's all open to the public and they can come in and do experiments. And so you have to wear a white lab coat because it's COSI, right?
It's COSI,
you have to project like science and everything you do. So even though on the grounds of The Ohio State University, you will not find a linguist in a white lab coat, if you go downtown to COSI, you might actually see a linguist in a white lab coat. But yeah,
well, that concludes the interview. Thank you so much for your time.
That's been a lot of fun.
And to our listeners today, we hope you enjoyed our time here today with Dr. Jon Stevens, and we hope you tune in soon for the next Postdoc Spotlight interview. See you then.